Today we have three true stories of lost treasure in Alaska. The first story is of a man that kept returning to a small village buying prospecting supplies with gold. That is, until the locals decided that they wanted to know where this gold was coming from, so they decided to follow him. The second story is about a man from Pennsylvania who headed to the Klondike to strike it rich. He did strike it rich, but he also died under very mysterious circumstances. The third story is about a robbery gone wrong. The robber was quickly caught and arrested, but the heist may have been planned by a well-respected member of the community that got off scot-free. Welcome to Hidden Treasures. I hope you enjoy the stories. In July 1897, a young man known only today as Frank lived in the small village of Welsh Hill, Pennsylvania. Frank was no doubt pondering his existence when he found out that gold had been discovered in the Klondike. Frank decided that the Klondike was where he could make a name for himself, so he told his friends and family that he was heading there to strike it rich, and he headed north. The Klondike was notoriously harsh. If you were already rich, you could hire a boat captain to take you up the Yukon River, and this made traveling a little bit easier, but most people had to trek in, and they had to bring the required 1,000 pounds of goods that they needed. Because of the weather and the harsh conditions, it was required that they had enough goods to last them for an entire year. Frank was one of these people. He headed up to Dawson. He brought in the 1,000 pounds of required supplies. He ended up setting up camp about 50 miles from the Canadian border. Frank was very successful. He ended up staying there for 4 years and finding gold. Frank had all of these jars that he had brought his food in, and when he finished the food from his jars, he would replace the food with the gold that he found. So after 4 years of being there and finding all of this gold, he had all of these little jars filled with gold. These little jars is what he used to take the gold back to Pennsylvania in. So after 4 years, Frank and all of his little jars of gold headed back to Pennsylvania. When he got there, he didn't keep it a secret. He showed his friends, he showed his family, he showed everybody in town that he found all of this gold in Alaska. Not only that, but he was very generous with his gold. He helped out his family, he helped out his friends, he helped out the town. So the little village that he was from actually became kind of this wealthy little area. He also told all of his friends and all of his family that this was only a small amount of the gold that was actually up there, and that there was plenty more waiting on him. So he was only there for a few months before he decided that he needed to head back to the Yukon and to gather more gold. And that was the last anyone heard from him for the next few months. This was a little unexpected, as Frank was very close with his family and would regularly send back letters. Then one day, a letter arrived from a stranger in Dawson. The letter simply stated that Frank had died from a mysterious illness. Frank's friends and family did not believe this letter. They believed that this letter had been sent to appease the people of the town so no one would come looking for him. So Frank's sister, who was especially skeptical of this, decided that she needed to head up there and she needed to find out what happened for herself. So Frank's sister headed all the way to Dawson, all the way out to Frank's camp, and when she arrived, she opened up the door, and to her surprise, Frank's body was sitting right there, frozen in his bed. No one had dug him a grave, no one had provided him any sort of services, but they had looted his cabin. Frank's cabin was in shambles. All of the floorboards were pulled up, all of the walls were pulled off. Someone had clearly been in there looking for Frank's gold. Frank's sister actually looked at all of this and realized that because his place was so torn apart that the people who had done this probably didn't find anything. Once you find something, you don't continue tearing apart the cabin, and the cabin was just completely destroyed. Frank's sister brought Frank's body back to Welsh Hill, where she provided a funeral service and they buried him with his family. Frank had told everyone in town that he had more gold, and what he brought back was only what he could carry. So everyone knew that there were more jars full of gold up there somewhere, but nobody knew where they were, and they're most likely still there today. In the early 1880s, a Frenchman showed up in the village of Hoken that is now part of the Alaskan Peninsula. This is a very sparsely populated area, mostly comprising islands. The largest city in this area today is Juneau, Alaska, and it might surprise you to find out that the population of Juneau is only slightly above 30,000. So even today, this isn't a highly populated area, but back in the 1880s, it was very sparsely populated. Not only were there very few people in this area, but nearly 100% of the people that lived in this area were native. So it was obviously big news, and the word traveled very quickly when anyone new showed up in the area. So obviously news traveled very quickly when this Frenchman showed up in the area and started buying prospecting supplies using gold. And this particular village was populated by the Haida people. The Haida people were native, so they were obviously experts of the land. They were great craftsmen, great fishermen, but these people were also known to be great seamen. Throughout their history, they would actually travel up and down the coast raiding other villages and other tribes. They were historically known as a somewhat aggressive people. It was once said that the Haida were actually very much like the Vikings. Upon hearing this, the Haida issued a statement stating that they were not like the Vikings, that the Vikings were like the Haida. So back in the 1880s, this Frenchman was showing up in these people's village, and he was purchasing these prospecting goods using gold. So the first time he showed up in town and he purchased these supplies and he left, they thought that it was just a single person that was traveling through and they would never see him again. But they were wrong. Just a few months later, he showed up again and did the same thing. He purchased more supplies, he paid in gold, and then he was off on his way again. So they thought that this guy might be prospecting somewhere around the location, and they set out a plan next time to start asking him questions and find out who he was and where he was from. So the next time he showed up, they put their plan into motion. They had kind of these set questions that they started asking him, that the shop owner started asking him, but the guy just wouldn't talk. He wouldn't tell him anything about his past, anything about himself. All they knew is that he was a Frenchman, and he kept showing up in town, buying these supplies and paying in gold. So the next time the man showed up, the shop owner did the same thing. He asked him a few questions. He was very polite. He gave the man the supplies, and the man paid for it in gold. The shop owner immediately went and got a few locals in the area, and they decided to track the Frenchman to go out and find out where he was getting this gold. These locals tracked this Frenchman, and they finally ended up losing track of him somewhere near Dahl Island. The Haida searched the area, but they couldn't find him, and they searched the area for the treasure, and they couldn't find the treasure. They believed that he knew that he was being followed, and he got out of there to save his life. But again, they were wrong. The Frenchman actually showed up in Hoken one more time. He boarded a steamship, headed for British Columbia, disappeared, never to be seen again. The Haida searched and searched for the location where he was getting this gold. They went down to Dahl Island and anywhere around there, but they never found anything. It's believed to this day that the Frenchman was spooked by being followed out there, and that he gathered up as much gold as he could, and then he headed out for British Columbia. It's also believed that the source of his gold is still out there today, and no one has ever found it. As these prospectors were finding all of this gold in the Yukon, there was also plenty of money to be made in services. The people that made the most money when gold was discovered were not typically the individual prospectors, but the people and companies that provided the services to the prospectors. For example, these prospectors needed supplies, food, clothing. You can think of Levi Strauss. That's where they started, was making denim jeans and denim clothing for these gold prospectors. Also, when these prospectors were gathering their gold, they needed secure transportation from their claims back to wherever they were from. This is where companies like Wells Fargo came in. Wells Fargo is well known as a bank today, but back then they were also a bank, but they also provided secure transportation for gold prospectors. Similarly, when gold was discovered in the Yukon, they needed to be able to transport this gold from these rugged, inhospitable regions down to civilization. The Yukon River was perfect for this. It's the easiest way to travel. These were the highways back then. They could load all of this gold onto a boat and travel straight down the Yukon River. Also, there are plenty of failed prospectors in the area that are broke and that need a job, so the workforce is already there. The problem with hiring men that were failed prospectors is that they were there looking for gold, and now you're hiring them to transport the gold that they were there looking for that they didn't find. Obviously, this could be an issue, but the workforce is already there. It's easy to hire these guys, so that's what they did. So this story is about a robbery on a steamboat on the Yukon River. Just keep in mind throughout this story that this is not the lone story, and that actually many prospectors decided that this was the way that they were going to get their hands on gold. In 1901, a steamer left Fort Yukon, as it usually did at this time, carrying a large shipment of gold out of the gold territories. Also, which was normal at the time, a watchman had been hired to watch over the gold during the duration of the trip. This watchman had been hired in the area and was no doubt a failed prospector that was down on his luck, that was looking for a job, and had been hired for this specific job. Along the voyage, nothing was out of the ordinary, nothing took place, everything seemed completely normal until they arrived at Victor Landing. At Victor Landing, the staff went back to check on the watchman and the gold, only to discover that both were missing. The crew that found that the gold and the watchman were missing immediately notified the other crew, who immediately notified the authorities, and everyone began a search for the watchman. They very quickly found the watchman hiding under Victor Landing. Also, it should be noted that Victor Landing was named after a well-respected gentleman in the area named Victor, who had recently purchased some placer claims that were not producing. It was believed at the time that the watchman and Victor had actually planned this prior to the voyage, and that they had planned to steal this gold and then later on claim that it had been found at Victor's claims. Though everyone believed that this is what happened, it could not be proven, and the watchman actually went to prison for a very long time, but Victor got off scot-free. As for the gold, it ended up in the place that almost every one of these heists ended up, and that is at the bottom of the Yukon River. What these would-be robbers would do is they would actually be hired as watchmen or staff on board the steamer. During the voyage, they would go back to the gold, they would tie up a buoy around the bags of gold, and right before they ended up at their final destination, they would throw the gold along with the buoy overboard, so the gold would sink down and there would be a little buoy on top of the water, and they could go back and retrieve it once everything had cleared. This sounds like a great idea, and they should be able to get away from it as long as they can evade the police long enough to get back and gather the gold. This almost never worked out. The Yukon River has heavy currents. It was a very fast-moving river, so when they would tie these buoys onto the gold, they would throw it in, the buoy would become detached, and the buoy would just go downstream, and the gold would be on the bottom of the river. Also, the authorities knew this was going on. When a steamer showed up and several members of the crew were missing and the gold was missing, then the first thing they did was go back upstream and start looking for buoys. So if there was a buoy there, they recovered the gold. If there wasn't a buoy there, no one recovered the gold. The first flaw was the most common, where the buoy would become detached, swept away, and the gold would be scattered across the bottom of the Yukon River. This happened many times, and to this day there is probably still lots of gold scattered across the bottom of the Yukon River. If you enjoyed the stories, don't forget to like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.